focus on the riots in his country and what they mean for French policy. He's joined by two Muslim leaders who just returned from meetings in Europe with government officials. The Council on American-Islamic Relations hosts this hour-and-a-half event.
Good morning. My name is Arsalan Iftikhar. I'm the National Legal Director for CAIR, the Council on American-Islamic Relations, the nation's largest American Muslim advocacy group, headquartered here in Washington, D.C. And on behalf of all of us, I would like to welcome all of you to our panel discussion today entitled The French Riots, Disenfranchisement and Integration. We have a very distinguished panel of speakers here today, and we hope to get a good working dialogue as to what is transpiring right now, what has transpired over the last few weeks in France, and what are some of the lessons that we can learn about it in terms of how we help integrate minority communities into Western societies. Disconnected from their past in the Muslim world and uncertain about their future in modern-day Europe, many of the people who began the rioting in the first week of November have come to see themselves as citizens of nothing but 93, the postal code for the outer areas of the Paris suburbs where most of the riots have been taking place over the last few weeks. The country's 5 million strong Muslim minority community is the largest in all of Western Europe, comprising nearly 8% of the entire French population. Most of the Muslims in France live in the rundown suburbs that have been rocked by the unrest in recent weeks. Average unemployment in the area is 21%, more than twice the national average, and rising. Amongst men under the age of 25, the rate jumps to 36% unemployment. French Senator Dominique Voynet said that, quote, "We haven't paid attention for such a long time. There is a sense of abandonment." They didn't act like that because they're Muslims, but because of the misery that they're living in, said Kamal Kaptein, rector of the Grand Mosque of Lyon in eastern France. And Dalil Boubabakr, the Paris Grand Mosque rector, who heads France's official Muslim council, said that, quote, "There weren't just Muhammads and Alis in those groups of rioters, there were Tonys and Daniels as well." Sebastian Roche of the National Center for Scientific Research said that those who participated in the riots are not political militants. They are not religious militants. Their profile is typical of street delinquents, young, poorly educated. They commit acts that do not benefit their cause, if they have any cause at all. However, what we're starting to see both here and abroad is certain elements of media and political circles trying to equate the riots that are going on in France with some sort of growing global jihadist conspiracy. Their equation is absurdly facile in my opinion, but awfully comforting to some. There's rioting in France. There are Muslims in France. Fundamentalist Islam can be harmful and violent. Therefore, the French riots are caused by Muslims. Once in France, these people have been marginalized, ostracized, and many times societally oppressed. The great French soccer player Zinedine Zidane put it so well when the national team was asked about the rioting. He said, "I was raised in one of those suburbs," said the gentle genius. "They built a supermarket in the town, but no one who lived there and bought there was ever allowed to work there." To keep in mind, when the French team won the Soccer World Cup, they were celebrated as national icons. Now many of their friends and cousins in the suburbs are considered scum. This is an interesting dialogue indeed as to the integration of general minority populations in Western societies. And we are very honored to have the distinguished panel that we see before us today. Our first speaker will be Ambassador Jean-David Levitte. Ambassador Levitte presented his credentials to President George W. Bush on December 9th, 2002. Ambassador Levitte has had a distinguished and outstanding career in the French Foreign Service, serving on the staff of 2 French presidents and holding various senior positions in the French Foreign Service. Mr. Levitte was assigned to his first position in the United States as second counselor at the Permanent Mission of France to the United Nations in New York City. In 1988, he was designated to his first position as ambassador and served as a French permanent representative to the United Nations office in Geneva from 1988 to 1990. President Jacques Chirac appointed Monsieur Levitte as French permanent representative to the United Nations in the year 2000, his most recent position before the President won today as French ambassador to the United States. It is with great honor and privilege that I would like to introduce Ambassador Jean-David Levitte of France.
Thank you very much for this presentation, and I'm delighted to be once again at the National Press Club. When I was proposed this discussion by the Council on American-Islamic Relations, I accepted immediately because I thought that it was a golden opportunity to discuss at length about a very complex problem. And now that violence has abated, that we are back to a normal situation in our suburbs, I think it is time to engage in this dialogue to see what it was, but first what it was not, and what the government may do. So let's start immediately by what it was not, and I think it's important to start with that. I think the word riots is a bit too strong. If you compare, for instance, with the riots which happened in Los Angeles in 1992, the word is certainly too strong. In Los Angeles, you had 54 dead, 2,000 wounded. Here, in all these impoverished neighborhoods, you had 2 teenagers who died when they jumped over the wall of an electricity substation, and 1 adult who died after being wounded by and hurt by teenagers. That's it. No guns in our streets. But the main difference with Los Angeles, for instance, or other riots, is that there were no adults in these streets. In our neighborhoods, there were teenagers between age 12 and age 20. And I think this is a very important nuance. So I would say it's less riots than social unrest triggered by the death of these 2 teenagers, and then it spread from one neighborhood to the other, from one teenager to the other, with a copycat phenomenon, with the mobiles, the internet, or simply seeing on the screens what was happening in the neighborhood next door or next city, and then it was spreading, and it lasted two weeks. But it was more social unrest, in my view, that riots like in Los Angeles in '92, to take an example. The second thing which is very important to understand, and I'm joining you in your analysis, is that it was not about the role of Islam in France. It has nothing to do with the clash of religions or civilizations or cultures. And I think it's very important to understand that. You may say, but are you so sure? Yes, I am. First, we have absolutely no information that there were organized movements with leaders. On the contrary, they were totally non-organized, disorganized groups of teenagers without any leader, and it was one of the difficulties because we had no interlocutors. Second, religion played no role at all during these 2 weeks, either positive or negative. I say positive because the leaders of the Muslim community in France did their best. The imams, Dalil Boubaker, the head of the overarching organization regrouping all the Muslim organizations of France, issued a strong statement. The more radical Islamic group like Tabligh issued also the same kind of statement, calling fatwa, calling for the end of unrest, which was un-Islamic. But nobody listened in these impoverished neighborhoods. Nobody listened. So religion didn't play a role, either positive or negative. Third, as you said, they were not only Muslims. It's too easy to say, they are Muslims. No. The heaviest sentence, which was delivered after these unrest, was delivered to a young man, 20-year-old, in northern France. He's white, he's not a Muslim, and he committed an arson attack in Arras, and he was condemned to 4 years in prison. It has nothing to do also with Islamist threat. Some media established a connection between the terrorist attacks in Amman and the French impoverished neighborhoods. But we never saw any link, direct or indirect, any sympathizer of Al-Qaeda in these neighborhoods. Absolutely no link with Al-Qaeda. Absolutely no link with events in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the Middle East peace process. And by the way, it's interesting to note also that if one synagogue was attacked, I should say only one. I say that because if you compare with the situation in 2000, 2001, where there were a number of incidents against Jewish establishments, schools, synagogues, houses, and so on, the situation is completely different now, even during these 2 weeks of unrest. It doesn't mean that we don't fear recruitment of young jihadists in our suburbs. Of course, we do care, we are preoccupied, but it's a different story. We know that in some places, some mosques, some houses, there are jihadists recruiting young kids, young teenagers, to be sent to Iraq for jihad and then back to France for jihad in France. But this is a different phenomenon, and it has nothing to do with the social unrest in these impoverished neighborhoods. Last, it has nothing to do either with the principle of secularism and the law banning all conspicuous signs of religious belief in our public schools, including headscarves. No teenage girl participated in the demonstrations. And if you look at the outfits of these young male teenagers. They were not Muslim outfits, but very Western, I would say American kind of outfit. And I don't resist the temptation of quoting the Office of Research of the American State Department, which issued recently its analysis once a year, covering the whole world, and about the Muslim situation in France. I quote, "Large majorities of Muslims in France voice confidence in the country's government, feel at least partly French, and support integrating into French society," end of quote. And this was accompanied by a poll. According to this 2005 survey, 95% of French Muslims have a favorable overall opinion of France. 89% of them express confidence in public schools, and 65% in the national government. So this is an American survey. So I said what it is not about. Now, then what it is about. Well, first question, where did it happen? And it will help us to understand why. Where did it happen? Well, as I said, in destitute neighborhoods. We have more than 100 of them. It means that it's not all neighborhoods, and it means that it's not big cities. If you take Marseille, for instance, Marseille is the second largest city in France, and it is by far the big city where the percentage of Muslims is the highest. No unrest at all in Marseille. And no unrest in a number of neighborhoods where you have a Muslim population, because these neighborhoods were in good shape. So it's only in destitute, impoverished neighborhoods. Second question, what was attacked? Well, what was attacked, as you've seen on your screens, is first cars. 9,000 cars were burnt. And they were the cars of their parents. These teenagers put on fire the cars of their neighbors, their parents, their friends. Second, they attacked their schools, nurseries, gymnasiums, and of course police stations. And 96 of these buildings were damaged or destroyed. And 126 policemen were injured on duty. And all in all, the cost of these 2 weeks of unrest is estimated at $250 million, including $20 million for the 9,000 cars. So why did these teenagers did that? Well, my explanation, and it's the starting point for our discussion, my explanation is that these teenagers feel alienated and discriminated, both socially and economically. They don't want to affirm any difference, but they want to be considered as 100% French. They are demanding more liberty, equality, fraternity, and not less. They are not fighting to be recognized as a minority, either ethnic or religious, But on the contrary, they want to be accepted as full citizens of the French Republic. They want to be part of the French dream. And let's admit it, I say we, French authorities, over the last decades, made mistakes. And probably the number one mistake was the construction of hundreds of high-rises in response to the housing crisis of the 1960s, 1970s, when we had this wave of immigration, because these hundreds of high-rises together transformed certain neighborhoods in ghettos, concentrating all possible problems: unemployment, drugs, insecurity, and that's where certainly we failed. And as President Jacques Chirac said in his intervention, his speech of November 14th, it is a crisis of direction, a lack of points of reference, a crisis of identity. And of course, a number of these teenagers are also living in deconstructed families. Most of the time, single mothers or unemployed parents, violence at home. So it is also a failure from parental authority. And the result is the creation of, I wouldn't say gangs, but groups of young teenagers, because they more or less go to school, at home, no parents, or one mother working hard, not present, no parental authority. So they go in the streets. You have a creation of these groups of teenagers. They have no place to play, so they organize themselves, invent their own subculture, if I may say so. So this is the complex phenomenon that we are facing today in these impoverished suburbs. Now, what can be the response of the French government? Well, the first thing to do was, of course, to restore law and order. Police has arrested nearly 3,000 people, and now 640 individuals are in prison. But more important, maybe, is the need to restore dialogue. And this is being done. This dialogue is reorganized, reopened at all levels in these neighborhoods. We have more proximity police to maintain a daily dialogue with these teenagers. The mayors are doing their best to connect or reconnect with these groups. We have a number of local community organizations, and they are given additional resources to be in a position to do a better job. But at the same time, we needed a global, overarching, comprehensive policy. And it's put in place. It's been decided to spend in the next months and years a total of $42 billion in help, aid to these neighborhoods. And number one will be education. What will be done in terms of education is very concrete. First, the government has decided to triple merit scholarships for students from these troubled neighborhoods. Second, to also triple boarding school programs that reward excellence by getting deserving students out of their impoverished environment. Third, a mentorship program organized by what we call les grandes écoles, that is political science. We have a number of of grandes écoles, kind of our best universities, if you wish, and we encourage them to open up as Sciences Po, Political Science School, has done to help more and more students from these poor neighborhoods to attend their programs. And fourth, apprenticeship programs will be available for failing students beginning at age 14 to help them to get a job fast. So that's number one, education. Number two, housing. As I said, when and where the housing has been rebuilt in a better way, we had no social unrest. So we know the way forward. And it's not a new development. We have already started. $30 billion have been invested in these housing programs, but we must speed up these programs. And so the government, the Prime Minister, has asked that renovation delays be reduced to 18 months, and we will make a special effort to transform these destitute neighborhoods into more lively places with not only better housing, but also gymnasiums, restaurants, coffee, cinemas, and so on, to make these neighborhoods lively cities. Third, jobs. That's, of course, the best way to integrate. If you have a job, you have a future. Until the day you have a job, you feel that you are not integrated in the social fabric of France. What the government has decided is quite spectacular. The young people from all these troubled urban areas will all be received by the labor exchange in the coming months for a completely individualized assessment of their qualifications. And within 3 months, they will be offered either a contract or a training program or an internship. So it's really a bold move. And this government proactive policy, which has started months ago, is getting results. The level of unemployment for 6 months in a row has been going down. But as you said, the problem is these destitute suburbs, because that's where the level of unemployment is the highest. And that's why we have to address it head-on. And, of course, the best way to succeed is to have jobs in these impoverished suburbs. And that's why the government has decided the creation of 15 additional opportunity zones, that is, zones where businesses that create jobs will be able to operate tax-free for 5 years. And finally, but maybe it's the most important, the French Republic must fight against all forms of discrimination. We cannot ask young people to integrate on the one hand, and on the other hand, accept the fact that their origins sometimes prevent them from finding work. Fighting discrimination is not just a moral duty, it's also the best way to put an end to the violence. And the French president, the French government have created a high authority to fight discrimination and promote equality, equal opportunity. And this high authority has been given the capacity to impose sanctions when discrimination can be proven. So we hope that slowly all those with comparable diploma and experience will be given the same opportunities to get jobs. So all this show that for the French government, for the French society as a whole, what happened during these 2 weeks was a kind of wake-up call. We know that the way ahead will be a difficult, long-term process. But we want to remain faithful to the ideals of the French Republic: liberty, equality, fraternity, and to make this old French dream a reality for all the French citizens. We are totally determined to succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Levitte, for your thoughtful and insightful comments as to the context of what has transpired over the last few weeks within France and what the French government is doing to help ameliorate the situation, to help further integrate the French Muslim community into the greater French society as well. The timing for today's panel could not have actually been any better. Myself, along with the last three panelists on our panel today, just returned this past weekend from Brussels, Belgium, where we took part in a State Department-sponsored dialogue entitled Muslim Communities Participating in Society, a Belgian-U.S. Dialogue, which was sponsored by the United States Ambassador to Belgium, Mr. Tom Korologos, and facilitated here stateside by my dear friend Bruce Sherman from the Board of Broadcasting Governors, who's on our panel as well. And so we're going to get a little insight as to how the American Muslim community dialogued with our European counterparts, what lessons we learned from them, and some insight that we may have given them in terms of how to successfully integrate into their own European society as well. Our next speaker on the panel will be Mr. Nihad Awad, who is the Executive Director of CAIR, the Council on American-Islamic Relations. On November 8th, 2005, CAIR issued a press release which went out to over 12,000 international media outlets calling for a peaceful end to the rioting in France. CAIR's statement stated that, quote, "Dialogue and mutual respect, rather than senseless violence or repressive tactics, are the only answers to social, political, and economic grievances. Islam seeks just and stable societies and condemns the wanton destruction of lives and property. We agree with French Prime Minister Dominique de Villepin, who said that, quote, the struggle against all discrimination must become a priority for our national community. In addition, it is imperative that people of all faiths and ethnic backgrounds in France come together to help address critical issues of unemployment, alienation, racial discrimination, and further social integration as well." And so our final three panelists will help give a little more insight into what we learned in Brussels this past week. So our next panelist I would like to introduce to the podium is Mr. Nihad Awad.
Thank you, Arsalan. Good morning. We were happy that we were part of this trip to Brussels, Belgium, sponsored by the State Department with the help of Ambassador Tom Korologos and the work of Bruce Sherman, who will come later and brief us on why and how it happened. But first, I was pleased to see and hear Ambassador Levitte talking about these issues with openness and frankness. It helps us all understand what it is and what is not. And I think that was very fruitful. When we went to Brussels, Belgium, to meet with the local Muslim community, we went there on a fact-finding mission, to listen to their issues, to learn from their experience, and definitely they have a rich experience, and to see if we can help and cooperate. At the end of the conference, we announced, and several other Muslim organizations who were there announced some initiatives in working together. We listened to their experience, and I personally learned a lot from it, including the following. Number one, they are immigrant community. Although the community of Muslim Belgians who converted to Islam is very few compared to the Moroccan and Turkish communities who constitute the majority of the Muslim community in Belgium. I found out that they have been fully integrated in the political system. In fact, I was surprised that probably out of 74 senators, they have 5 Muslim senators, and all of them were women. So Muslim women are senators in Belgium. In Brussels Parliament, they have about 30 members in the House of Representatives. And I was told that the number of the House of Representatives in Brussels numbers around 70. So we're talking about almost 40% of the House of Representatives in Brussels are Muslims of Turkish and Moroccan origin. However, I found out that the community itself is not fully integrated in the society. And I heard from young people who complain about discrimination. These are Belgian-born second and third generation who feel qualified, they speak the language, they know the culture, they're qualified technically for the jobs they apply, but when their names are mentioned, the Muhammad, the Abdullah, they get rejected. Or when it comes to housing, they will apply for an apartment. Over the phone, the entire process goes smoothly. When they reach the last name, then there's a turn in the application. Or a convert Muslim who told us that she applied for an apartment. The entire process went very smooth, including the name, but when she went to see the apartment and the manager, there was a turn and she was rejected. So they feel that, and of course we cannot generalize, but these are the signals that the French unrest and the LA riots send to the society that something is wrong and we have to pay attention. We also learned that they did not have many institutions. There are probably less laws, anti-discrimination laws, that prohibit people from discriminating against other people on the basis of national origin, religion, or last names. And here where our organizations, American Muslim organizations, come to help. The Council on American-Islamic Relations, along with other national organizations, over the years have helped integrate American Muslims into the larger society. Of course, we cannot judge the similarities between the two societies. There are different components, there are different laws, different environment, different history, but nevertheless, basic human rights are God-given, they're universal, and all societies should adapt and embrace. What we have done at the national level here, since we are an anti-discrimination and anti-defamation advocacy organization, we utilize the laws that are in the books in the United States, especially the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And we're always grateful to the struggle of other minorities, especially African Americans. The names come to mind always: Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and current leaders like Jesse Jackson. All these people stood up to remind the society that discrimination is not good and it's not beneficial. In fact, what we have done over the years, we have proven that the system works for the individuals, and we empowered individuals to help themselves. And I'll just give you some examples. This is one of the things that we wanted to share with our counterparts in Belgium and also in communication with the leaders in France. We thought maybe CAIR and other organizations can offer some help. For example, although this is a tiny, the camera may not even see it, it's a pocket guide. It's called Your Rights and Responsibilities. It shows American Muslims how to be involved locally, how to volunteer, how to apply for jobs, when discriminated against, what to do, how to communicate with the media. It's an extensive resource guide. We distributed over 600,000 of these to American Muslims. Over the years, we fought discrimination. And we fought discrimination through mediation and bringing resolutions. We countered giant companies, Fortune 500 companies, and small companies, and just reminded them that discrimination is not good for them or the victims who are discriminated against. But also, we took preventive measures, including issuing guides, like an employer's guide to Islamic religious practices. That shows the rights of the employees, especially when they're Muslims. They have maybe certain needs. They're not different than others, but they have to be paid attention to. These measures educate employers and empower individual Muslims to fight discrimination. We have also guides for employers, for educators in the school system. Many Muslim students feel isolated, and they feel that their needs are not met. And we, again, send these guides to school systems nationwide. Even how to deal with Muslim patients when it comes to the issue of privacy, modesty, and otherwise. We get many Muslims who come to be treated from different Muslim countries or from local communities. We help local officials, law enforcement, on how to deal with the Muslim community, including correctional facilities. We know that Islam is growing in the federal prison system, and we want the authorities to know on how to effectively communicate with the Muslim community. We believe these steps help integrate the Muslim community. It shows that the system works for them. In addition to that, we work with coalition groups, civic organizations like the NAACP, Latino organizations, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commissions, the ACLU, and most importantly, we are very open and work closely with interfaith organizations. We encourage Muslims to be active in the local, state, and federal elections. This way they feel that their voice counts, and in fact, it did count in many elections nationwide. These are some of the things that we proposed for the local Belgian Muslim community. We offered to go there and train some of their leaders on how to deal with the media, and we offered them to come here for training in the United States. But also we asked some of their senators and House of Representatives to come to the United States and show some Muslim activists, those who would like to run for public office, and how best they can win in their elections, what kind of platforms, what kind of political discourse, which parties they should ally themselves. Should they have only a Muslim political platform or just a fully integrated and comprehensive political approach? All these lessons are to be learned, and we do not want our European counterparts to take them longer time to learn the techniques we learned here, and neither we would like to take longer time to learn the political process, so we have to learn from their experiences. I would like just to conclude with this following example that was given by Prophet Muhammad when it comes about the classes in societies. He said, and I paraphrase, that the liking of the society and the classes in the society is like people who are in the ship. The ship is in the river, and there are two classes of people. People who are poor, they are in the lower deck, and the upper class, the rich people, are in the upper deck. So when the rich people would like to get fresh water, they go directly and they get water from the river. However, the people who live in the lower deck, they have to go upstairs and get the fresh water. If they're given hard time to go upstairs to get the fresh water, then there will be problems. Some people in the lower deck thought maybe it's better to dig a hole and get water directly from the river. If the society allows people to dig holes in the lower deck, the entire ship will sink. And I think the riots, the car burnings, the riots in the streets in LA, all these are serious signals that our society, the policymakers, have to pay attention to and have to introduce a program that will be fully adapted by the society. That discrimination, visible, invisible, direct or indirect, has to be fought on all levels, and there should be laws on the books to help empower the individuals, because they have to feel that the society is with them, not against them. These are some of the lessons that we learned, and I hope that the coming discussion from our second two panelists will help give more insight. Thank you.
Thank you, Nihad. Just to let everyone know, there will be a Q&A session after all the panelists have spoken. The next speaker on our panel is Mr. Salam al-Marayati, Executive Director of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, MPAC, the largest public policy organization for American Muslims here in the United States. He was also a member of the delegation to Brussels, and hopefully we would like to see some insights that he has into general public policy issues relating to both our visit and the topic at hand today. So Mr. Salam al-Marayati.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important discussion. And I agree, it's the role of mainstream Muslims to help lift society and to counter anyone who is destroying it. It is our religious mandate to give life to our society and to counter anyone who is promoting death. You know, the ambassador spoke today, and I have to say that it's not so much that I just came from Brussels or am involved in public policy that brings me here to this discussion, as much as it is that I'm from Los Angeles, and that's the area where the riots were in '92, and there's some interesting comparisons between what the ambassador said and what we went through in Los Angeles. First of all, I have to say it's great that the French and the ambassador articulated this, is already talking about solutions. It took us 6 months to form a commission that had to deliberate and had to discuss and dialogue before we came to the same conclusion that the French are ready to embark upon now, and that is, it's an issue of discrimination, it's an issue of a feeling of isolation, of ghettoization, and we need to add more to counter discrimination and to improve housing and educational opportunities, and to let people feel that they own their own property and that they have ownership in their own neighborhoods and in their own communities. And in fact, in Los Angeles, the whole debate took place over whether to describe that as a riot or as an uprising or as a social unrest. And it was triggered by the Rodney King beating. And so there's still a lot of commonalities between what happened in Los Angeles and in the United States in the 60s and what's happening today in France and in different parts of Europe. Mainly that people want to live the French dream, the American dream. They do not want to live the French nightmare. And any way we can be involved in helping move that process along will help our society at large. And the final point in terms of the comparison is that gangs are formed because of the breakdown of the family structure, that young people formed gangs because gangs took care of their everyday needs, because they didn't have families, they didn't have community representatives, they didn't have friends in the larger community helping them, so they decided to form gangs. Having said that, let me just go over 5 general points from a policy perspective on this issue. The first point deals with national identity and citizenship. It is the responsibility of the government, of the state, to promote policies of integration, while it is the responsibility of community-based organizations, religious organizations, to articulate a stand on identity that is compatible with the outer society. In other words, the state must define secularism not as being anti-religion, but as being neutral on religion. if the state is perceived as being against a religious minority, then it is perceived as being a form of secular fundamentalism. And it's very important for the state to take that responsibility in promoting integration. While it is the responsibility of community-based organizations to articulate the Western Muslim identity, the American Muslim identity for us here, the French Muslim identity for the Muslims and French there. In other words, that we belong here and that our future is here. Perhaps our ancestry and our roots come from a different part of the world, but our future is here. As we say in our organization, for us in America, home is where my grandchildren are going to be raised, not where my grandfather is buried. Maybe where my grandfather is buried, those are my roots, I'm very proud of them, but the way I look at the society and the problems that we all face should depend on the way other Americans are looking at that, not as how other countries are looking to these everyday problems. Number two, on this issue of identity, to go further into that, we are not immigrants anymore. The French immigrants are not immigrants. They are second and third and going on fourth generation people who were born and raised in those French societies. And the same thing is happening here in America. We have to counter then this notion of isolation and alienation. One of the other lessons that we learned in Belgium, somebody had did a study on the societies there, the Muslim communities there. And by the way, when we say Muslim communities in Europe, it's very different from saying Muslim communities in America. Because in Europe, you're really talking about an ethnic community. So in Belgium, for example, we're talking about a Moroccan or Algerian community, a North African community, as well as a Turkic community. So there's much more ethnic dynamics involved in European communities. And in France, we're talking mainly about Algerian communities there. But the sense of isolation of those communities, and not only isolation in the lands they live in, but also in the countries of ancestral origin. In other words, when they go and visit their ancestral countries, they go and visit, for example, Turkey, they are not regarded as Turkic. They are regarded as European. And when they live in Europe, they're not regarded as full-fledged Europeans. They are regarded as foreigners, as aliens to those society. So when we talk about isolation, it's double the agony, really, over those people. That there is a global ghettoization of these communities that leads to more anger and more frustration over their identity. Therefore, we need to deal with full citizenship and the acceptance of their religious background in those society as is, in order to fulfill the manifestation of the Western Muslim identity. Finally, there must be political representation. If they don't have access to decision makers, then that only adds to their frustration. For a group that is enfranchised, they have access to government. That government can take care of their educational and housing and employment problems for those who are disenfranchised, obviously. And there is no access. There is more a sense of hopelessness. Number three, I think our common goal is to break the cycle of failures. You live in poor neighborhoods that have poor schools, they give you poor paying jobs that keep you in these poor neighborhoods. Therefore, there's a higher level of unemployment, and these societies that we're talking about now also have shifted from manufacturing-oriented societies to service-oriented societies. So if these populations are not going to be equipped in being employed in service-oriented societies, then the ghettoization and the disenfranchisement and the unemployment rates are only going to get worse. So therefore, there needs to be this breakage of the cycle of failures. Number four is the problem of radicalization of these communities. And here, we agree full-heartedly that there is no radical elements involved in the social unrest. However, we do have to be aware of the high possibility that al-Qaeda and other extremist groups exploit exactly these kinds of situations to recruit young people who are disenfranchised and angry and frustrated into their movements by saying, they're not going to help you. The only way out of that is to join this extremist group and to join by confronting society, not by being involved in that society. So the radicalization problem is definitely important for us to at least be aware of, even though we agree this is not an issue of a religious conflict. I mean, to think that this is a religious conflict is like saying the problem in North Ireland between Protestants and Catholics is a religious conflict. There's probably more evidence of religious divide there than there is in these other situations. So it's social and political inequities that could create a sense of radicalization. My final point, therefore, is that in order to counter any possibility of radicalization, collaboration between governmental and non-governmental organizations is important, and it is key at this time. The French ambassador said that the French Muslim community had issued its pronouncements against violence and for dialogue, yet nobody listened. This is exactly what we want to repair at this time, that when religious leaders speak, they are authentic and legitimate within their own communities so that people listen to them. If we're only looking for moderates, quote unquote, who are supporting the status quo policy, I'm not saying that the French Muslims are, but in certain situations we see a problem where the term moderate simply means the one who agrees with our policy and tells us what we want to hear. But the moderate is one who renounces violence, yet he may or she may disagree with our policies. In fact, if they disagree with our policies, they are probably more legitimate and authentic to those indigenous communities. So if we want those people to be listened to in those communities, and by the way, the British Task Force on Countering Extremism is coming up with the same conclusion in Britain. Therefore, you must allow for legitimate political discourse on all policy issues and not make that a litmus test over whether people are going to be accepted into our pluralism or not. In fact, the best person is the one who wants to change the policies of his or her country in the interests of his or her country. That's what patriotism means. So there needs to be collaboration between governmental and non-governmental organizations, between civic and religious organizations, looking at both economic and political opportunities and solutions for these kinds of problems. And with that, I think we are positioned to be more effective in countering extremism, in dealing with the social and political and economic inequities in our own communities, and countering ghettoization on all fronts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Salam, for your thoughts. Our final panelist is Mr. Bruce Sherman, Director of Strategic Planning for the Broadcasting Board of Governors based here in Washington, D.C. He was the facilitator of our conference in Brussels here stateside, which was sponsored by Ambassador Tom Korologos. And if it weren't for Bruce's hard work, this pioneering endeavor would never have happened. So we'd like Bruce to come up here and give a few thoughts on what transpired. Bruce?
Good morning. Just to put in context a little bit, my presence here and the event that took place last week in Brussels, I am the Director of Strategic Planning for the United States Broadcasting Board of Governors. The Board of Governors oversees all U.S. international radio and television broadcasting. However, this is a project that was a special initiative that the ambassador to the United States ambassador to Belgium, Tom Korologos, asked me to help him on in terms of providing a strategy for his vision for this initiative and in working in concert with the United States Embassy staff to execute it, to make it a success. So I'm here in that capacity and not in the capacity of someone speaking about broadcasting. I want to tell you just briefly what this was, what the rationale for it was, and what we did. Let me just say that in the first instance that it's purely serendipitous that the initiative took place at a time when there was some unrest in France. This initiative had been underway in terms of planning for nearly a year. The frame, however, of this initiative dovetails with current events in Europe, and that is that the idea here has been to bring together the American Muslim community and the Muslim community, in this case in Belgium, to look at how the two communities can work on fostering their participation in society. So the frame of the conference was the participation in society that we've heard about just now from each of the speakers. Let me tell you in short what this was. It was a people-to-people exchange between Belgian and American Muslim activists on practical matters of everyday life regarding Muslim participation in society, rooted in dialogue and carried out in a true binational fashion. When we say a people-to-people exchange, I want to underscore that the idea here was not to have another conference in which experts talked about Muslims, but rather to have a conference in which Muslims talked with Muslims about their participation in society. And that signals for us a fairly significant, it may seem subtle, but a significant shift in strategy that both Mr. al-Marayati and Mr. Awad have referred to in terms of coming together. It was a learning and listening exercise. It wasn't an exercise in which the American participants went to deliver a message. It was an exercise in which both American and Belgian Muslims came together to talk to each other about their common concerns, their common aspirations, the good practices that they're employing to foster participation in society, and just as important, to talk about what they concretely could do going forward. In other words, not to have a conference that lasted a couple of days in which everyone had a good feeling, but then everything stopped when the conference ended. As Ambassador Korologos has stated, this was the beginning, not the end. It's the start of a dialogue that we will now work hard to see continues into the future. Mr. Awad mentioned, in fact, CAIR's own initiatives, their own outreach to Muslims in Belgium. The conference yielded a number of specific follow-on initiatives. The Islamic Society of North America, Dr. Saeed participated, the Secretary General of the Islamic Society of North America participated in the conference. They announced at the conference's end a whole series of exchange programs, scholarships, and internships for Belgian Muslims to come to the United States. We had the pleasure of having the mayor of Dearborn, Michigan, Michael Guido, present for the conference to talk about how Dearborn, which has a population that 30% of its population is Arab American, most of that population is Muslim, how in Dearborn they have employed policies of integration at the community level. He was there with the mayor of Genk, Belgium, Mayor Jeff Gabriels, who also spoke to his own initiatives in his city to foster integration of Muslims and ethnic minorities. Those two cities have entered into a sister cities relationship as a result of the conference. And they are going to be exchanging their good practices, exchanging officials from both cities going out into the future. So what we can see in terms of what the initiative has produced is, again, a very worthwhile experience in entering into dialogue, but also specific initiatives that the two sides are committed to carrying out going into the future. Again, it was activists and not academics talking about practical matters of everyday life. And in terms of the dialogue experience, we employed something that was quite unusual. Because it was a dialogue experience, we did not have the typical academic conference with panels of experts, seated audiences, and then audience question and answer periods. We had people who were coming together as equals in a conversation in which they told their personal and professional stories, what they have experienced themselves in terms of fostering participation in society. And then we had them get into dialogue around specific topic areas. And those were civic life, economic opportunity, media, women's issues, and youth development. So the first day of the conference focused on the general theme of participation in society with personal and professional experiences shared across the two sides. The second day got into specifics about what is happening in each of those topic areas. And then the conference ended with the participants looking at, again, what they would be committed to do down the road. The basis for the dialogue. Some have asked us, why is it that you believe that there was something for the two sides to talk about? When we were organizing the conference, we had many questions that dealt with the fact that the Muslim communities in Belgium and the United States are very different. And that is true. They are very different in terms of socioeconomic status, immigration histories, current levels of integration. But what they both share is a circumstance of being minorities in Western secular societies in a politically charged post-9/11 environment. And I also share a desire to participate fully in these societies. So by bringing the two communities together, the communities themselves are in a position to offer each other encouragement, to offer each other hope, to do precisely what we have heard today is needed both in Europe and in America, and that is to ease the sense of alienation, frustration, and disenfranchisement that Muslims feel. The Muslim communities themselves can do this, in addition to the larger society entering into the conversation. So we wanted to afford the communities the opportunity precisely to get into a kind of conversation and dialogue that would serve that purpose. The participants in the conference, there were 32 participants from the United States and over 70 from Belgium. They represented all walks of life. Mr. Awad, Mr. al-Marayati had national organizations. There were, however, from the American side, participants, students, imams. We had a police officer, Musafir Siddiqui from Houston, Texas, who has been voted one of the top 10 policemen in the United States 2 out of the last 3 years. We had people involved in the media, filmmakers, journalists. We had a cross-section of people, heads of women's organizations. The idea was to connect as fully as we possibly could across a cross-section of Belgian Muslim life. And on the Belgian side, there were counterparts, twice as many as on the American side. But they were united again by the fact that they have their hands on community service and activism. And they're also united in that they are committed to participating fully in society. I can't stress that enough. This was a conference about participation in, not separation from, society. And again, the notion of using a Muslim-to-Muslim dialogue and having it be a people-to-people exchange is a departure in terms of what is considered United States public diplomacy. This was the first ever large-scale exchange between the Muslim community in America and the Muslim community in Europe, in this case Belgium. It's not that there haven't been exchanges of individual members of these communities, because there have. But in this case, what we were trying to do was create critical mass for a set of ongoing initiatives. And the way we sought to do that was to bring the two communities together in a high-profile way and to engage them in the process that I've just described. I'd be happy at the end of this to take any questions on the conference. I believe, again, that Mr. al-Marayati and Mr. Awad have spoken to some of what we accomplished there, and they can answer questions as participants in the conference. There were no, I would say this, no U.S. government officials participating in the dialogue. This was an effort to convene a conversation, not to control it, not to participate in it directly. And in that way, the United States Ambassador, Tom Korologos, felt that we could do our role in terms of the United States government participation to help on this question of Muslim participation in society. I would also say that the emphasis on dialogue is an emphasis that the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, has stressed over the last year in terms of a new public diplomacy for the United States government. It's also an initiative that Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, Karen Hughes, has stressed. In fact, Undersecretary of State Hughes visited with Muslim leaders at the Islamic Society of North America conference over Labor Day in Chicago. She talked to them, listened to them, got their ideas, and then encouraged them to take part precisely in this kind of initiative, to engage with the United States in reaching out to Muslim communities around the world. And I believe it's fair to say that this is the first time that that has happened in this significant way. So this represents a first in many respects. It is a prototype initiative. Many people have asked us, why did you start in Belgium? Why not in France? Why not in England? Why not in Germany? I think the simple answer to that is that we had in Ambassador Korologos someone who wanted to take the initiative and make it happen. And also to make it happen in a way that could be a model for use elsewhere in Europe. And so we will be having conversations in terms of looking at what we learned from this conference to see what we do going forward. Perhaps we do this in another country. Perhaps we do it in a slightly different way. But we believe we've begun a conversation. And that's what, again, the whole idea of this was, to start a dialogue with the Muslim communities engaging directly and with the support of the United States government and local authorities in Belgium. And finally, I would credit the Royal Institute for International Relations in Belgium, which was our local co-sponsor. They were very generous with their support and their time and their resources to help make this initiative happen. Thank you, Arsalan.
Thank you, Bruce, both for being here today and facilitating the wonderful dialogue that we had in Brussels. Now that all the panelists have spoken, we will be going into our question and answer session of the panel. Being the moderator, I have a few key points that I'd like to hit upon to sort of facilitate the question and answer, and then we will open it up to the audience for questions and answers from our distinguished panel. My first question for Ambassador Levitte is that in light of the riots that occurred in the beginning of November, how has the general French public's opinion of minorities, of immigrants, of Muslims. How has that been affected at all, if it has at all, in terms of just general perception? Have they always had a very high regard for the minority communities, a low regard? Has it gone up or down? So if you could comment on if the French government or any other independent agencies have tried to track the internal sentiment of the general French public in regards to the local Muslim community there.
Well, it's a very important but difficult question, and I would say it's difficult to generalize the answer. Of course, when you see violence in your street, it doesn't help to give a good opinion of those who are demonstrating or the cause that they try to promote. So in that way, it didn't help. But at the same time, as I said, it was certainly a wake-up call. That is, for the majority of the French, the question was, how is it possible, and why, and what can we do about it? And the fact that the government wanted to react fast, and not only by restoring law and order, but by proposing and implementing as fast as possible a comprehensive strategy to address the problem, I think it's the best possible answer. Now, I'd like to take advantage of your question to underline differences between the American and the French democracies, because you are a country built upon immigration and communities. We are a country built upon immigration. My father was born in Russia, my mother in Mozambique, but not based on communities, based on the idea that each French citizen is equal. And of course, the problem comes when the reality is different. And that's exactly the problem here. But the way we want to address the situation is to help give equal chances to these young teenagers to get a better future. Not by building communities which could be different from other communities, but by giving equal possibilities to each young teenager to have the same future as the other French citizens with the same diploma. The second thing I'd like to underline, because it's important, is the role of religion. In America, 40% or so of each citizen go to a church, a mosque, a synagogue once a week. In Europe as a whole, in France, it's less than 10%. Less than 10% and going down. So religion is less important and more private. We would never put on our banknotes, in God we trust. This is not part of our culture. It's more private. And last point I'd like to underline, because I think it's important, we have a great number of interracial or intergroup marriage. And I think it's very important. If you look, I don't want to make advertisement here, but this morning in the Washington Post, you have a very interesting paper about the daily life of a family in one of these impoverished neighborhoods. And it's about the story of two French people. One, the lady is white. The husband is from Western Africa, from Côte d'Ivoire. Both are French. Their children are French, of course. But it's about kind of difficult life in these suburbs on a daily basis. But what is interesting is that it's intermarriage. And it's quite often that in France you have these interracial or inter-community marriage. Because the social fabric of France is each citizen is equal. And we are supposed to be 60 million of equal citizens without any importance given to the communities. According to the law, equality and fraternity, hopefully, is the basis with liberty. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your answer, Mr. Ambassador. My next question that I wanted to facilitate was for both Salam al-Marayati and Nihad Awad. I don't think there's anybody on the panel here today or in the audience here today which would say that Islam was a motivating factor for the riots which occurred in France. Many observers say that most of the youth and the delinquents that were involved in this, in the senseless violence, were more fans of 50 Cent and Eminem than they were of Osama bin Laden. But Salam and Nihad both brought up a very valid point in that this sort of social, political, and economic marginalization of such destitute populations could provide fodder for terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda to potentially recruit some of these undereducated, very impressionable young teenagers to do things that they might not normally do. My question to the both of you, and to Salam more on a public policy level and Nihad at more of a grassroots level, what can we as Muslims, what can Western Muslim societies, talking about our Western Muslim identity, what can Western Muslim societies do both at the policy level and at the grassroots level within their own communities to make sure that the disenfranchisement of these communities doesn't lead to something further?
Thank you. Well, I think number one, we have to recognize that there is a problem of discrimination. So these people have to be given opportunities, they have to be given jobs, and as the ambassador said, if people do not have jobs, they do not have future. They have energy, they have hopes, they have to just match the two together. And if they feel that they have no hope in getting a job because of their ancestors' background, because of their last names, then no grassroots work, no civic group can just prevent maybe further violence from taking place. So I think the number one is a recognition by the society. Number two, recognition by the government. Number three, to have legislations that are very clear that individuals and organizations can use to prevent discrimination and preventing people from getting to their dreams from happening. Then the fourth thing is the civic and religious groups, what they can do, they can always remind people. For example, the fatwa that was issued, and I spoke this morning with one of the key leaders in the French Muslim Society, on November 6th, they issued a fatwa just to make it very plain and clear, because some extremist media in France and in the US tried to play this tone that it is religiously motivated. We were told, and this was very clear, that Islam and religion did not play any component in these riots. In fact, the Muslim leadership at different levels, from the mosques, the imams, to the national organizations in France, issued a clear fatwa for any young Muslim, saying that it is haram, it is prohibited in Islam to disturb the public peace and to destroy public properties and cause damage to any people. This is an Islamic principle. So no one can use religion to help fuel their anger and frustration against the society. So I think the bottom line is the society has to take some systematic and serious permanent measures to prevent discrimination from happening. And second, if discrimination takes place, there should be like some systems, recourse on how to redress these grievances. And of course, finally, probably, I don't know if they have any institutions in France where people can report discrimination. Like here, they can go to the Equal Opportunity Commission, they call our organizations, we mediate, we try to bring resolution. If there is no resolution, then we can go to court, and sometimes we apply public pressure. And that gives the individual a sense of dignity, that they're not lost. Some people are there to speak and help them.
Yes, we have this.
Okay.
Let me add to that, number one, we are trying to offer an alternative to radical ideologies. Because from the mainstream Muslim perspective, I think the struggle today is that on the one hand, you have government policies that don't respond to the legitimate grievances of the masses. Then you have the extremists, on the other hand, that don't represent the legitimate views and principles of Islam. They are hijacking Islam, they're exploiting the situation by promoting a militant extremist outlook. So it is our job as mainstream Muslims to offer alternative ideologies to the extremists and an alternative approach to dealing with these policy problems and obstacles within the policy-making arena. And therefore, we must declare our identity as purely American or European or Western within the Islamic context and call for more civic engagement and remove obstacles to political participation. This, in short, is what we are trying to do in creating space in public affairs for the Muslim community. In terms of the message of moderation, therefore, while we renounce violence as any means having any legitimacy in redressing the grievances, we also declare that our stand is purely for the reform of the Muslim attitudes and perspectives in modern life. And therefore, we must counter any notion of exclusion of women in public affairs within the Muslim community. We declare our stand for human rights that has a legitimate Islamic basis and for democracy against dictatorship, and that Jews and Christians and people of other faiths or people of no faith whatsoever are given human dignity according to the Quran. The Quran says God has bestowed dignity on the children of Adam. Therefore, it is the responsibility of the Muslim to defend the human rights of every human being. This is our approach to declare our part and our participation within the human family. Let me just end in response to the ambassador. I agree with him completely in terms of government's role is not looking to favor or even to identify religion. It is not the job of government to say that we are for this religion or that religion. And it is not the job of government to say which communities can or cannot develop. It is the job of government to maintain order within society, to oppose discrimination, and to provide equal opportunities for all groups. However, the main issue today is that there is the sense that there is a Muslim problem. And what we're saying is Muslim Americans and Muslims in Europe want to be part of the solution. They don't want to be part of the problem. Therefore, there must be a change, a shift in the paradigm in looking at these modern challenges. That while there's an establishment clause in America, that there's separation between church and state, definitely, and that it is not the job of government to favor one religion or of the other. When we keep talking about the jihadi problem and the Islamist problem and this problem involving Islam and Muslims, there must be, commensurate to that, solutions that identify Muslims in those areas. So therefore, we have to engage with Muslim communities in order to find those solutions. And I think that is the challenge of the modern governments in Western societies today. How to maintain the establishment clause, but at the same time, if you're going to be talking about Muslim problems, looking for Muslim solutions at the same time.
Thank you, Salam. I am now going to open up the floor to questions. If you could kindly say your name, your news outlet or organization, and to whom your question is addressed, that would be wonderful. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Sabah. I'm on the organizing council of the Islamic Association of Metro DC. We conduct Jumu'ah prayer and interfaith activities at a local congregational church. I'd like to thank all of the panel members, and especially the French ambassador, who is among us common people. And I would like to just express my sympathies to the events that have taken place in France and the loss of life and property to French citizens, and ask you two questions. One is concerning your comment concerning the destruction of property after 9/11 in the Jewish community. I was surprised to hear that and curious, the reason for that. The second question is, it seems that now national governments consider, let's say a religion of the state as being patriotism and nationalism. And of course, Islam being more a public practice than among Christians and Jews, in that our sisters wear hijab and we pray sometimes in public places. How can our needs be accommodated in the public sphere in the future in a way that they are not accommodated now?
Thank you very much for your kind words, and thank you for your two questions. First, about the incidents which occurred not after 9/11. They were not at all related to 9/11. They were connected more to the difficulties, I would say, of the Middle East peace process, the situation in that part of the world, and the fact that some in our French Muslim community feel connected with these events. And when there was the Intifada, they reacted, young kids, in the very wrong way of attacking Jewish establishments, synagogues, schools, and so on. So the government put in place a comprehensive policy to put an end to these incidents with success. And part of this comprehensive policy was to teach tolerance between religion in our schools, public and private schools. And I think it helped a lot to organize a better dialogue between religions, because even if it is private matter, when it has public consequences, we have to do something. So the number of incidents went down steadily in the first semester of this year. It diminished by 48%, and for the violent incidents, it went down threefold in the first 6 months of this year. So this is why I said don't mix up too many things. It's important to consider that religion had no role at all to play in the unrest in these impoverished neighborhoods. It is about social problems and about economic problems. Now, we respect religion, all religions, and we respect religions as private matter. We are a very secular state. Why? Because religion played a key role in French societies over the centuries. And we had massacres between Catholics and Protestants, and when the revolution took place, it was decided that we should put an end to what was the basic principle in French life, that is, the religion of a king was the religion of all those living in the kingdom, that is, Catholicism. So we adopted liberty, equality, fraternity as a principle, and for the first time, the minorities, including the religious minorities, at the time Protestants and Jews, got equal rights during the days of the revolution and then the empire and the republic. And it's a way to protect also Islam in France. Now, what we adopted as the law, wrongly painted as the law about the veil, is a law reaffirming that religion has no place in our public schools, and public schools only. It's a way to protect minorities, because until that day, that is the law of 1905, our programs in public schools were based on Catholicism. And the decision of the law is to ban all religions from public schools to protect the minorities. And that's what was reaffirmed by the law of last year, so that religion would remain private matter in public schools. Now, if you want to practice religion or have conspicuous signs of religious belief, you can go in private schools. And in the streets, or in the universities, in the shops, or in the facilities, offices, plants, you can wear religious conspicuous signs, and you will see in our streets a number of ladies wearing the veil. That's not a problem. It's only in public schools. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
My name is Nabila Zarka. I'm a freelance reporter from Algeria. My question is, Senator to Mr. Ambassador. I've heard some details about the plans of the French government to encounter this unrest, riots, or any eventual others. And the components of this plan seem to be kind of social, economical, but then, in the other hand, I kind of see mixed signals from the French government. In one side, that the French President, Mr. Chirac, says, recognizes it's a problem of discrimination, identity, all that. And then, on the other hand, Mr. Sarkozy still have some kind of negative signals. And potentially he's going to be the future French president. I mean, seeing his all that. Like, for example, the way that he's linking the, using the word, I'm sorry, I have to use that word, racaille, regarding the people who were in those riots. And then, which sounds for Algerians mainly like, there's a historical connotation like Biko. So, this is historical and political context of, and then seeing that the political system for 6 million people is practically locked. I mean, there are not a lot of opportunities to be represented in the Senate and the Parliament. So, and on the other hand, the gentleman who spoke before me, putting all that in the civilization and the cultural context of feeling like there is some kind of clash of civilizations here. I mean, you know, because in the l'imaginaire commun, the community there is that go and take out the women's scarf, oblige her, it's dévoilé une femme. It's kind of aggression. And then, so receiving all these signals, negative signals from the political system or the French government, don't, in my opinion, and you may see things differently, don't give a lot of legitimacy to all these plans. It's because it's not just about social or economical reasons. Like it's not typically Los Angeles. It's not typically Brixton, 1981, Great Britain. It is about dignity and about identity. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. Let me say that we have a very complex problem. And the first duty of the government was to restore law and order. And it's true that in some destitute neighborhoods, you have, as I said, groups, I may say gangs, and leaders of these gangs, I wouldn't say are teenagers criminals, because maybe the word is too strong, but certainly they create a lot of unrest for these neighborhoods. And I must underline that the victims of this violence were the inhabitants of these destitute neighborhoods. Those who saw their cars in flames or the nurseries destroyed were the parents of or the uncles or the relatives of some of these young teenagers. So restore law and order was the first priority. But at the same time, I think you're right when you quoted President Chirac. He said very strongly that all the citizens of France have equal rights, and all the sons and daughters of the French Republic should be treated in an equal way. That's the French way. The problem is how can we achieve that goal? That's why the answer of the French government could not be only restore law and order, but to address the root causes of the social unrest. And that's why we have place. It's not a new development, but the emphasis is very strong on education, jobs, better housings, and a fight against all forms of discrimination. Now, it will be difficult to succeed. We don't have affirmative action à la française, if I may say so, but two members of the French government, Azouz Begag and Meka Chera, are from Maghreb origin, and it's very good signal, a political signal. What we have to do is to do more in French companies to give equal opportunities and in our French universities to encourage more recruitment from these destitute neighborhoods to show that they have a future in our society and they have equal rights and they can live or they will live the French dream as all the other citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I want to thank our entire panel of distinguished speakers for being here today, especially French Ambassador to the United States, Mr. Jean-David Levitte, Mr. Nihad Awad, Executive Director of CAIR, the Council on American-Islamic Relations. You can see more of our work at www.cair.com. Mr. Salam al-Marayati, Executive Director of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, MPAC. You can see more of their work at www.mpac.org. And Mr. Bruce Sherman, facilitator of the Belgian-American Muslim Dialogue, which took last place in Brussels, Belgium. I would like to thank everyone for coming today. Obviously, the overall purpose of our panel today was to help engage and empower minority communities, especially the Muslim minority communities, as a means of enhancing participation in society. And so as broad discussions in dealing with enfranchisement in both political, economic, and social terms, I think that we can help try to make an important contribution to the well-being of all minority communities and how they are treated in their respective communities. So thank you all again, and have a good day.